Tuesday, September the 2nd. September 2nd, 2014. And so now we continue with what did we break off?
226.
Right, page 226, this is with section number 40. So this is an important section because it deals with what types of rebirth are possible for the beings in any particular plane of existence. So he starts off with the beings in the immaterial plane, the immaterial realm. So when one passes away from an immaterial realm, one may be reborn in superior immaterial realms, but not in lower immaterial realms. And one may also be reborn in the sensuous plane with a three-rooted rebirth consciousness. Okay, then if we look at the guide, first it says that the determination of rebirth differs significantly for worldlings and for noble disciples who have not yet reached arhatship. Of course, for arhats, there's no more realm of rebirth. But the noble disciples at the three lower levels, stream enterers, once returners, non-returners, still have a rebirth. But there's different principles that govern their rebirth and that of ordinary worldlings. And so the text is now describing the procedure only in the case of worldlings. But then I think in compiling the guide, we got the information on the procedure for the noble disciples as well. So it says that the beings in the immaterial realms might go on and develop the immaterial jhana that corresponds to their level of rebirth, or they might develop the higher immaterial attainments, but they don't develop those that are lower. So if a being is existing, for example, on the plane of infinite consciousness, then he might go on to develop the meditative attainment of the base of nothingness, the base of neither perception nor non-perception, but they won't develop the base of the infinity of space. And so when they pass away, they may be reborn on the same plane. That is, if they strongly develop the attainment that corresponds to their level of rebirth, or they might be reborn on a higher plane, but they won't be reborn on a lower jhana plane. However, if they fall away from their jhana attainment, how that's possible, I don't quite know, but this is what it says, that they could fall away from their jhana attainment, and then they will be reborn in the sensuous plane of existence by the power of their access concentration, and thus they could take rebirth with one of the three rooted sense sphere resultants. So when they come back to the human world, or to one of the sense sphere deva worlds, they'll have three roots in their rebirth consciousness. And it's even said, there's a sutta, it comes in the Anguttara Nikaya, in the Book of Threes. Yeah, it's the Book of Threes. It speaks about how some meditators develop each of the formless meditations, and then they take rebirth on the corresponding formless level of rebirth, immaterial plane of rebirth. But then they pass away and they take rebirth even in the animal realm, the realm of the pretas, or in the hell realms. But this sutta, it shouldn't be interpreted too literally. It doesn't mean that they go immediately from the immaterial realm down to the lower worlds. But the point of the sutta is that if they haven't developed the wisdom of insight, when they pass away from the immaterial realm, they'll take rebirth in the human realm or in the lower deva worlds, the heavenly worlds. And then, if they commit unwholesome karma, then they can take rebirth in the lower realms. But it says that the noble disciple, that is the disciple who's reached at least the first stage of enlightenment, when they take rebirth in the immaterial realm, then they either go higher or they attain final nirvana in that realm itself. Okay, then coming back to the root text, it says, when one passes away from the fine material sphere, one is not reborn without roots. And then if we look at the guide to this section, it says, okay, those who pass away from the non-percipient realm are reborn in the sensual plane with the sense sphere resultant citta having either 2 or 3 roots. So before they took rebirth in the non-percipient realm, they had developed the 4th jhana, or in the Abhidhamma scheme, the 5th jhana of the Abhidhamma scheme. And so that was a pretty powerful meditative consciousness with 3 good roots. And so when they pass away from that, they have to have either 3 roots or at minimum 2 roots, but they won't take rebirth with a rootless resultant consciousness. But from that realm, you have to come back to the sense sphere. You can't go further in the fine material sphere or the immaterial sphere. Okay, but it says now, passing away from elsewhere in the fine material plane, one may be reborn either in an immaterial realm, that is the deities, the beings in the fine material realm, might develop the immaterial jhanas. If they do so, then they can be reborn in the realm that corresponds to that immaterial jhana. Or they can be reborn in a fine material realm if they have possession of a fine material jhana. Or else, if they fall away from jhana in that realm, then they can be reborn in the sensuous plane if one has generated strong karma tending towards that plane. I'm not quite sure I understand this. But it then says, one who takes rebirth in the sensuous plane after passing away from the fine material plane must do so with either a 2-rooted or a 3-rooted rebirth consciousness. I guess when it says one can be reborn in the okay, now I see the point. One can be reborn in the sensuous plane if one has generated strong karma tending towards that plane. Oh, this is my, what do you call this, my power drink. Okay, just let me explain this point. That, you see, the beings in the fine material plane, even though sort of like their basic experience there is the jhanic meditative experience, but they can still give rise to sense sphere cittas. They could even give rise to greed and attachment. I think they don't give rise to hatred in that realm. my memory is correct. So the citas of hatred don't arise in that realm, but the citas of greed, and also even the citas with wrong view arise in that realm. But some of those beings take themselves to be permanent, eternal, everlasting. So that's a kind of wrong view. So that would be a greed-rooted citta accompanied by wrong view. So if that wrong view becomes strongly established, and then they're generating a lot of sense-sphere cittas, those cittas will lead them into the sensuous realm. Or else they might even become attached to, they're like supposed to be like really beautiful forms and beautiful sounds in the heavens of the fine material realm. So if they become attached to those beautiful forms and beautiful sounds, and then they neglect their jhanic meditation practice, so now they're developing sense-sphere cittas, and that's going to lead them back to the sense sphere. But when they come back to the sense sphere, again, they have either a two-rooted or a three-rooted rebirth consciousness. Okay, then we come back to the root text on the top of page 227. After passing away with a three-rooted existence in the sensuous plane, one may be reborn anywhere. So with the three-rooted rebirth consciousness in the sensuous plane, as for example, we're human beings, when we have a consciousness with three roots, we could develop the fine material jhanas and be reborn there. We could develop the immaterial attainments and be reborn in the immaterial realm. We could do a lot of just wholesome, but still mundane, meritorious deeds, and then we might get reborn in one of the heavenly worlds. We might do a lower level of meritorious deeds, we get reborn in the human world, and then if we do generate a lot of unwholesome karma, then we can be reborn in any of the lower realms. So the human realm and probably the lower data worlds lead in all directions to all the other realms. Okay, then in the root text it says, the rest, that is those who pass away with two roots and no roots, are reborn only in the sense sphere realms. So those who have two roots and no roots, they don't have the third root of non-delusion. And so if one lacks that root of non-delusion, one isn't capable of developing either the fine material sphere jhanas or the immaterial sphere jhanas. And so one can't be reborn in the fine material realm or the immaterial realm. So it has to be reborn someplace in the sense sphere realm. If one, with two roots or no roots, does a lot of meritorious deeds, they can be reborn in the sense sphere realm with three roots. If they do a medium type of wholesome deeds, they could be reborn with two roots. If it's just moderate wholesome, or a weak degree of wholesome karma, they could be reborn again with no roots. And if they do unwholesome action, then they can be reborn in one of the lower worlds with a rootless rebirth consciousness. So those are the possibilities for the worldling, somebody who hasn't reached any level of super-mundane realization. And now the guide explains the possibility of rebirth in the case of the noble disciples. So it says that in the case of noble disciples, there can be no regression from a superior type of death consciousness to an inferior type of rebirth consciousness. So all noble disciples pass away with a three-rooted death consciousness, since if they didn't have three roots to begin with, they couldn't have become noble disciples. To become a noble one needs a rebirth consciousness, bhavanga, with the root of non-delusion, because it's from the root of non-delusion that penetrating wisdom can arise. And so noble disciples still in training, that is the non-arahants, re-arise either in the same plane or in a higher plane, and they acquire either the same type of rebirth consciousness or a superior rebirth consciousness. And then those who have reached the path and fruit of arhatship do not take rebirth in any plane. And then there's a table, pretty complex table at the end of this chapter. You can study it at your leisure, but it shows in detail the realms of rebirth, the possible realms of rebirth on pages 230, 231. This is table 5.7. Section A shows the possibilities of rebirth for worldlings. And table 5.7b on page 232, 233 shows the possibilities of rebirth for those in the higher training. Okay, then we'll go on to the next passage. Then when we finish the chapter, then we'll take questions. So it says, so for those who have thus taken rebirth, from the moment immediately following the cessation of the rebirth linking consciousness, that same type of consciousness apprehending that same object flows on uninterruptedly like the stream of a river, and it does so until the arising of the death consciousness, so long as there is no occurrence of a cognitive process. So right after the rebirth consciousness arises and stops, then the bhavanga, the flow of the bhavanga begins. And the bhavanga takes the same object as the rebirth consciousness. That object will be either the karma that was performed in the last existence, a sign or symbol representing that karma, or the symbol of the new destination into which one has been reborn. And that is the object of the bhavanga, and then through the whole course of life, that bhavanga will flow on over and over again, rising and falling, always with the same object, except when there is cognitive processes, when we're seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, or entertaining mental objects, then the bhavanga is interrupted for the cognitive process. So during our waking hours, most of the time our consciousness is engaged in cognitive processes, but again and again, as we're awake and even going about our activities, the mind is constantly dropping back into the bhavanga for a few moments, apprehending that object, which was the support for the death process, then coming back up again when a cognitive process begins. so now it's speaking about that stream, that same type of consciousness continuing flowing on like the stream of a river. And it says, being an essential factor of existence. This consciousness is called the life continuum. This is the word bhavanga, bhava means existence, and anga means a factor, an essential factor. So bhavanga is the essential factor for existence, that which preserves the continuity of existence. Okay, so this consciousness is called the bhavanga. At the end of life, having become the death consciousness, it isn't really that the bhavanga becomes the death consciousness, but at the end of the life, the death consciousness occurs, which is of the same type as the bhavanga, same type of consciousness, with a three-rooted, two-rooted, rootless, same object. So the death consciousness occurs in the form of passing away, and then it ceases, and thereafter comes a new rebirth consciousness, and the others continue to occur, revolving in due sequence like the wheel of a cart until one attains nibbana. I don't see until one attains nibbana in the Pali.
No, it's not.
Excuse me?
We don't see that sentence.
I don't see it. It just says, Tatoparang, thereafter, Pati Sandhadayo, the rebirth linking and so forth, Parivatanta, Pavatanti, revolving occur, Rata Chakam Eva, like the wheel of a cart, Yata Kamam, in due sequence. I guess we added until one attains nibbana for clarification.
I don't think it's in the English translation of this.
You don't have it there.
No.
No
No nibbana.
Oh, then that's more correct.
Yes. This one is exactly what's in
We're
English.
just revolving in samsara all the
Excuse me?
time. Samsara all the time over here.
So my edition holds up the prospect of liberation.
We'll put it in.
What was the last sentence? Until liberation or
No, it says until one attains nibbana. Look in your guide. Do you have that in your guide?
No.
No? I don't know how it got in this.
Wishful thinking.
Okay, then the guide explains exactly what happens after the rebirth consciousness. I guess this is according to the Abhidhamma commentaries. So the rebirth linking consciousness is followed by 16 moments of the Bhavanga Citta. So this is going to be the 17 moments. Then a mind door adverting consciousness arises, followed by a process of 7 jhavanas in which an attachment develops to the new existence. So this is the first cognitive process in the new life, and it takes the rebirth linking consciousness as its object. And the jhavanas consist in sense-sphere chittas rooted in greed, dissociated from wrong views, because this is just a being that has just come into existence and can't have any views. And it's happened spontaneously, so it's unprompted. Okay, so when this process ends, then the Bhavanga arises again and perishes and continues whenever there is no intervention of a cognitive process. So in this way, the stream of consciousness flows on from conception until death, and from death to a new birth, revolving in due sequence like the wheel of a car. So you have exactly the same as that, right? How did you get me bonnet in there? Anybody else have this edition? You have Nibbana in yours. So we are the privileged elite. We're the noble ones, you are the ordinary worldlings who just go on.
I know we have all these dumb questions.
Okay, and then he concludes with some verses. Just as here, so again in the next existence, there arise rebirth linking consciousness, life continuum, cognitive processes, and death consciousness. Again, with rebirth and life continuum, the stream of consciousness turns around. The wise, disciplining themselves long, understand the impermanence of life, realize the deathless state, and completely cutting off the fetters of attachment, they will attain peace. So here comes a reminder that even though ordinary people go on revolving in the cycle of birth and death again and again, but those with wisdom undertake the discipline or the training, and then they come to realize the impermanence, the instability of life, and then they attain the deathless state. Okay, so that takes us through the compendium of the process free. At this point, I'll ask whether there's any questions. Sam and Hector have a question? Basha in the back. No, wait, you are third. Nisha D. Sand.
Bhante, when you're talking about jhanas, does it matter what method of meditation we use to get to those jhanas, like whether it's insight or mindfulness of breathing or metta?
It does, in terms of the Abhidhamma scheme of the possibilities of rebirth, no, it doesn't matter. Just whatever is most congenial to oneself.
But it doesn't affect the rebirth linking in
I would think it doesn't affect the plane of rebirth, but I would think that, say, somebody who does the Brahmavihara practice maybe has more potential of loving kindness and compassion sort of as potentialities in the mind, whereas somebody who is like a really like strict anapanasati person who doesn't want to be bothered with that, Brahmavihara stuff, would have sort of like cooler mind, more, maybe intense focus. But as far as the possibility for rebirth, it really all depends on the level of concentration, not on the subject itself. Okay, then Hector, right here, third row.
Many people are near death in hospitals.
Yeah,
And just before death, they're given drugs
yeah.
to allay the pain.
Yeah.
How does that change the death process?
It's a question outside my sphere of experience, but let me just try to conjecture what it might do. we ourselves, we give precedence to the idea of trying to pass away with a clear mind, not to be drugged when we're passing away. Though I understand that if a person is in really intense pain, you don't want them to have to to endure that extremely intense pain. My guess is that, though it's most desirable to be able to pass away with a clear mind, my guess is that what happens for most people, what is going to come up as the karma that determines the rebirth will be habitual karma. And so, even if the person is, a drug is administered to a person, so the person isn't fully conscious, but it still will be a habitual karma that comes in and governs the jhana processes. And so in that respect, I don't think, if the person is made either dimly conscious or unconscious because of the drug, that it's going to lead them from the possibility of a brighter rebirth to a lower rebirth, because it's generally going to be the habitual karma. But usually we want to keep like a clear focus so that we could bring all of the power of our mind to the guiding the rebirth process. So the person who's under the influence of the drug doesn't have that capacity to bring all their awareness and the power of the mind to the death and rebirth process. Okay, now we have our fascia.
般地阿弥陀佛，我问这个问题，是我很想了解，说在这个阿毗达摩里面所讲的中阴身的部分是指哪一个形态？
The question I would like to ask is I would like to understand what in the Abhidhamma system, the intermediate state is what kind of state?
Well, what I was saying is that in the Theravada Abhidhamma system, the Theravada Abhidhamma system doesn't recognize an intermediate state. So according to the Theravada Abhidhamma system, they say that immediately after the death consciousness, the rebirth consciousness occurs without anything in between. Though I say my personal opinion, based on, as I said earlier, based on reasoning, also accounts that I've heard from people, or accounts that I've read of people who recollect their previous life and passing away, and also a number of passages in the Pali Suttas themselves seem to support the idea that there is an intermediate state. Ting de dong?
Yes.
Ting de dong, what?
死亡心到这个结生心这个中间，他会看到业相或去相，然后转投胎到他要去的地方。这个中间要多久？
Okay, so between the death chitta to the birth linking chitta, and then the person would see the sign of the karma or the sign of the destination, and then get rebirth. And what's the time for that duration from death chitta to birth relinking chitta? The time between these two chitta and with all that's happened in between.
Well, I was trying to explain that in the Theravada system, Abhidhamma system, there is no time between the death and the rebirth moment. Now, I think in the Sarvastivada system, there is the intermediate state. So there is an intermediate state in the Sarvastivada system, but I'm not really familiar with that system. So you would have to ask, you could ask Venerable Dhammadhi, but he knows that system quite well.
那是不是因为个人的业力的关系，它的速度有不一样？
Is it because the different karma of individual, so the 速度吗？速度不一样，我刚才不清楚。
就是说期限吗？期间？
从死亡到解生啊。
就是说他在要找到下一个目标的时候，他的期限，有没有因为个人的业力的关系，然后有分长或短？
So when a person is to get the next object, is the duration different according to the individual's karma?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
所缘是什么？因为结生到死亡已经中间没有，它就是紧接着，所以刚刚问的那个所缘是什么的所缘？
就是说他看到业相的时候，说他要投身到他想要去的地方，这个是不是因为每一个人的时间是不一样的？如果说我很快就找到我要去的地方，我是不是就很快就走了？还是说我根本不想走，就一直待？
可是刚才说上座部没有中间这个。Her question is still about the time. If a person sees the sign of the karma or the destination of karma, and then he will get reborn.
Yeah.
So what's the duration? The duration varies from person to person because of their individual karma.
This is while the person is still alive, right?
No.
After they die. Well,
She keeps asking if there's.
okay.
Yeah.
上座的佛教，他们说，色身以后不见，不见，
无见，无见，
不见有
解生是。
相身。
Okay, Bante was speaking in Chinese. Immediately after the death chitta,
Wait.
immediately arrives the birth-relating chitta.
Oh, I see. You're translating for the English-speaking people. No, I'm going to stand up. Okay, so again, I have to say, according to the Theravada system, immediately after the death consciousness, the rebirth consciousness arises. So there's no time interval between the two. So, 色身到相身没有时间。可是看了以后，相身有相身。Is that correct? More or less?
I'm sorry. I think probably her question is because from death chitta to, although there is no any time duration between the death chitta and the birth-related chitta, but for a person who there should be time for that sign of karma or sign of destination to take place.
Yeah.
Unless these 2 or 3 signs take place out of nowhere, it doesn't take time. It doesn't take time for these 3 signs to happen.
Oh no, while the person is still alive, but sort of entering upon death, at a certain point, when the sort of life is going down and getting very, very close to death, then one or another of those 3 potential objects will appear. Exactly when, I don't know. You know, it would be getting pretty close. Maybe it could start to appear even maybe hours before death. And so this is why it's possible if one sign starts to appear and then the person seems agitated, worried, or frightened, it's possible by speaking to the person to change the quality of the mind so that a different karma will then come up to the surface and then give rise to a new either karma, a new sign of karma, or a sign of a different destiny. And so if the person is given, you know, proper treatment within that last phase of life, then it could change the direction of the rebirth. I've read some cases of that, of how that happened. Okay, so Douglas, Ed, and Ravi.
Thank you, Bhante. My question is about the sign of destiny.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, is this basic principle sort of exclusive to the near-death moment, or could there be something within a lifetime in which a person can have a vision, in a way, of karma that will fruit in their own lifetime?
I'd say that's possible. Yeah. I really don't know, but I think it's quite possible.
Thank you, Bhante.
It could be, what they call it, a premonition. Actually, it's something more than a premonition. It's a foresign. So it could happen in an earlier part of the life. Okay.
Thank you, Bhante. I'm referring now to the paradigm that we find in the last paragraph of 227. And I'm assuming, and I'm asking if this is correct, that this correlates with the, well, it said that with the elimination of the fetters. Does that mean that the roots of greed and hate are still somewhat present for a stream enterer, but then as they are weakened as you go to once return, and then ultimately eliminated, the roots are completely gone. But ignorance does not disappear until you've eliminated the first 5, and ultimately you're into the second 5 to arahantship. Is that somewhat correct? In other words, the roots of greed and hate are less deep in the beginning than are the roots of ignorance that takes longer to eliminate.
Okay, I understand the question. Let me just... Okay. Greed in the form of sensual desire and hatred are eliminated, hatred in all of its degrees, not only what we understand by hatred, but the milder forms like irritation, aversion, discontent. Those are eliminated at the 3rd stage of realization, the stage of that marks the attainment of the stage of the non-return.
Yes.
Now, even the non-returner still has the subtle form of craving, which is the form of greed. This is the attachment to the blissful experiences of the jhanas and the peaceful experiences of the formless meditations, and even some degree of a craving for the experience of the fine material realm and the immaterial realm, and still has ignorance. So the craving for the form material experience, for fine material experience, for immaterial experience, that's still a manifestation of the root of greed. And ignorance is the same as the root of delusion. And so those two are eliminated only at the transition from non-returner to arhatship.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that detailed description. And I just have a quick little follow-on. How in the world did they get no more than 7 rebirths for stream enterer?
Experience.
I don't know. Ask the Buddha. And I said, Ravi comes. And then we'll have to take a break after this.
Bhante,
Unless it's a very short question.
this is a layman's question, I'm not an expert, so.
Yeah.
You're discussing about the death and the rebirth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if there is a transitional plane or
Yeah.
whatever, wouldn't that be in itself a rebirth and continuing and aggregating rebirth? So in which case there's a continuity of the process.
Yeah, that is the way my teacher, Venerable Balagoda Nanda Maitreya, tried to interpret it. He said that, he read these reports of people who have passed away, people, everybody passes away, of people who say that they have a recollection of having passed away, and then they describe, after passing away, that they're sort of floating around in this, call it a twilight zone, till they link up with some couple that they feel attracted to. Then they find themselves getting drawn into the womb and then coming up. So he said that we could interpret that as a rebirth in the Peta realm.
I don't have a problem with that actually.
Yeah, but the thing is that the Peta realm is described elsewhere as like a realm of misery. And the Pretas, though they don't, the suffering there is not as intense as in the hells, but it's said to be, like having this strong hunger that can never be satisfied, insatiable thirst. Whereas the reports of these people who have these memories of passing away and floating in this twilight zone, as I said yesterday, it's sort of like a very neutral state, not really painful or miserable. It's just like, as I use the example, when you get on the bus in New York, you're riding to Boston, you just sit in the bus waiting for the bus to arrive. It's not really painful, unless you have to go to the bathroom and there's no bathroom in the bus.
Must it be a better world, or could it not be some other slightly...
Okay, one could interpret it that way, maybe. Yeah. Okay, we'll take a break now, a 15-minute break. Then we'll come back. And before we take the break, we'll do a little exercise. And you still have questions, you bear them in mind. We'll have the evening for discussion.